Hello, my name is Lloyd Crooks, and I'm doing a series on textual criticism. And what we're going to look into Mark 16, verse 9 to 20. And we're going to, it's an interesting subject, um, very controversial. Personally, I don't see the reason why it should be controversial. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to recommend certain books. I'm going to probably put in the link. This is Nicholas Lunn, The Original Ending of Mark. A New Case for the Authenticity of Mark 16:9-20 by Nicholas Lunn. It's a book I highly recommend, and certain things I'll be referring to it. I do have a number of books on Mark 16:9-20. This is probably one of my favorites, especially for the grammar, the style, and the wording, Markan wordings. It's probably the best one for that. This is a very good book. Dean John William Burgeon, The Last 12 Verses of Mark. An interesting thing with Dean Burgeon, he's had a lot of stick um, uh, for his opposition to the Alexandrian text. But what people fail to appreciate, what a highly rated scholar he was basically somebody who looked at the original manuscripts themselves. So if we compare to Westcott and Hort work from printed Greek texts, yeah, where he would look at the manuscripts. He was one of the top experts on the early church fathers, especially with quotations from scripture in their writings. So, and if you read F.H. Skinner, he refers a lot to Dean John William Burgeon. So he was a real giant in terms of text criticism. So I don't think it's really been appreciated in the hindsight of time. Another book also recommend by William R. Farmer, The Last 12 Verses of Mark. Hopefully I'll put those in the description. So it's supposed to be controversial, but we're going to go into some of the evidence, yeah? So basically, the evidence for Mark 16:9-20, 99% of Greek manuscripts have these verses. That's 1,653 manuscripts. And that figure can um, be adapted. There's no evidence for inclusion or exclusion in terms of the papyri, because a lot of them are sort of portions. But from Codex Alexandrinus right through, except for two manuscripts, um, they have Mark 16:9-20. So out of 1,653, only two don't have it. You could say two and a half, I'll explain that later. So, and that's from the 5th century right up to the time of printing. Over 1,000 Greek lectuaries have it. So basically, these were the readings that were set aside for particular days, particular holy days, Easter, etc. And over 1,000 Greek lectuaries have this. So it's basically according to the days of the ecclesial calendar, which particular readings or texts would be read out. Support from versions, citations, dissertation, Old Latin, most, Curiton, Syriac, Pishta, Heraclean, Syriac, Palestinian Syriac, Latin Vulgate, Arabic, Old Slavonic, well attested in the Coptic, Armenian, Ethiopic, and Jordan. So most of the versions have it. So one of the things Mark 16:9-20 has, not only strong attestation in the Greek manuscript tradition, but also in terms of the versions of translation from the Greek into the native languages around. And it's interesting about the Latin Vulgate with Jerome, because Jerome would have made himself available some of the best Greek manuscripts at the time. And he was about the 4th, 5th century, about 4th century. So he's a very good witness to that. Support from early fathers. And this is not limited yet. So I'll mention just a few, and also the ear from the east and the west. There was Justin Martyr, Tatian, Irenaeus, Hippolytus, Marinus, Didymus the Blind, Eusebius, and Jerome. Now, the reason why I put those in bold, because they've been classed as witnesses against the validity of Mark 16:9-20. So there's a lot of witnesses. It's more than that. Augustine referred to it. So it's a lot. It's to the east and to the west. Mark 16:9-20. All right. So we're looking from the 2nd century right through. So argument against, the main argument against is Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus. These are the two sort of oldest, most complete Greek manuscripts. So it's only these two, and I think there's a Latin version which doesn't have it. So it says these are the main reason why the argument against Mark 16, 9 to 20 is it's not in these two Greek manuscripts. Old Latin Codex Bobby Aeneid, the only manuscript without the only Old Latin which doesn't have it. Armenian, 99 out of 220 don't have Mark 69:20. Georgian, one in the 9th century and the other in 10th century, and the Georgian lectionary system. And Ethiopic, only 2 lectionaries omit the reading. Fathers against Clement, all right? So Clement and Origen are being classed as people who are witness against it, but Clement doesn't really quote directly from Mark anyway. And so the interesting thing here is that, and Origen didn't quote, but they've been used as witnesses against the inclusion of Mark 6:9-20 when they actually don't really quote. What you find the early church's fathers quoted was mainly from Matthew, all right? So it's interesting that Clement's use, called Dean John Burgeon's book, is that he doesn't even quote from the end of Matthew's gospel, all right? And he doesn't refer to the end of Mark's. So really, it's interesting why he's quoted, because he doesn't really quote from the end of Mark's gospel at all right, the whole chapter, and Matthew's gospel. And Origen the same as well. He didn't really quote from Mark, so it's not really it's an argument from silence. So here's the one that's used is Eusebius. Yeah. So a question came to this paraphrase. A question came to Eusebius about the alleged contradiction between the resurrection story in Matthew and Mark. So this person who's writing to Eusebius is saying, well, can you explain this contradiction in the resurrection story between Matthew and Mark? So it's clear the person who's writing Eusebius knows about Mark 16:9-20. Now, here's where a lot of scholars have used this. And one of the things I do have an issue, and I know James Snapp Jr., he's very strong. And also forgot to recommend his book. James Snapp Jr. also got his website and his book, some great information on there about that. Now, is that if I'm not a technical scholar and expert, but my point being, my reasoning being, is that if I, as a layperson, can find this information, why can't people employ to do this? So what you find here is that the questions asked about the contradiction. Eusebius responds by saying the difficulty admits of twofold. He was for getting rid of the entire passage, which states not met in all the copies of Mark's gospel, the accurate copies at all events, making the end of Mark's narrative come after the words of the young man who appeared to the women and said, "Fear ye not." Yeah. And when they heard it, they fled, said nothing, for they were afraid. So that's how um, uh, most scholars stop there, right? Or they continue on. In almost all copies of the Gospel according to Mark comes to the end. What follows, we've met with seldom and only in some copies, certainly not in all. So if you look in terms of part of highlighted, not met in all the copies of Mark, then he switches to seldom and some, and certainly not in all. So there's quite a contradictory statement there, right? But it's clear that cannot be correct. And the reason why it cannot be correct, if it's not been any copies, how did this person write to Eusebius know of it? And not only that, why that there's such a strong witness in the versions in the Greek tradition, 1,650 surviving, but it can't be not in all the copies, because why would so many survive? Not only in the Greek manuscript tradition, but also in the versions as well. So he says that. He said basically, that if you have, and he's not saying this is what he's saying one way they could get rid of this contradiction is to basically get rid of, say it's not found in any manuscript, yeah? And if that's be the case, and look what he's saying for himself, this then is what a person will say, a person, not him, who is for evading and he trying to get rid of a gratuitous problem. So therefore, if it's not there, we can settle that alleged contradiction. But let's see what he goes on. But another, and you don't really read this from the scholars, but another on no account daring to reject anything, whatever which is under whatever circumstances met within the text of the gospel, will say, here are two readings, as is so often the case elsewhere, and that are both to be received, insomuch as by the faithful and pious reading is not held to be genuine, rather than that, nor that than this. So this is why you find sometimes, and I'll give example of John 1, verse 18, where Irenaeus, he mentions where it says begotten son or begotten God, he mentions both readings. So you see their attitude towards textual criticism. They weren't strong on omitting, yeah? All right then, or rejecting particular readings, should I say. And then look what he says. Well, then, allowing this piece to be really genuine, our business interpret the sense of the passage. And he goes on to quote from Mark 16, 9 to 20. All right. So if you look at the last highlighted portion, for it was early the first day of the week that he appeared to Mary Magdalene. So if he had believed it wasn't found in all the manuscripts or seldom some, he wouldn't need to answer the question. He said it's not there. He would have said what modern scholars say today is that as some and even some preachers, they will not preach from it because it's not there. And they will say it's not seen as genuine or part of Mark's gospel. But he clearly sees that because he goes to interpret the passage and to reconcile Matthew's account with Mark's account. And then he begins to quote from it. So it was known to him. So that's why when I put those who support the reading with the early church fathers, I included Eusebius and also include Jerome as well. All right. So he clearly dealt, because if he didn't believe it, he wouldn't have answered the question. But he said, well, then allowing for this to be really genuine, our business is to interpret the sense of the passage. And that's what he begins to do. Yeah. Jerome basically repeated Eusebius. And it's interesting with Jerome includes it in the Vulgate with no notes. So Jerome does not sit there and goes into a textual debate about it. He actually repeats the question using a different person requesting information, but he just basically repeats what Eusebius had raised. But the very fact he included it in the Latin Vulgate, and there's a general consensus, unanimous consensus in the Latin tradition, the Old Latin, that this passage is genuine. Okay. Now, I'm going to finish on this point. Now, one of the things the argument scholars make is about non-Marken words. Now, this is where this book comes into its own. He really goes into the grammar, he goes into the style, the linguistic evidence. And I've never seen anybody go into this to this level of depth in terms of literary evidence, thematic evidence, really goes into it. I cannot recommend this particular book highly enough. Yeah. So he breaks it down in terms of simple ways. So the argument is about unique words, the word straight away or immediately and again, the historic presence, the word kai, which means and so forth. Yeah. Then. Yeah. So he takes out periscopes within the Gospel of Mark. So he looks at Mark chapter 1, 2 to 11, 17 unique words. The usual Markan words of immediately is only one. Again, none. Historic present, none. The word kai, 14. The word day, 1. Mark 9, verse 42 to 50. So he's breaking it down. So we have 7 periscopes or 7 portions throughout the Gospel of Mark. And then we've got Mark 12, verse 1 to 11, 19 unique words. The word immediately, 0, again, 1, historic present, nil, 19, kai, and day, 2. Now, the similar ones with Mark 16, 9, 20, I've highlighted, put in bold, is Mark 13, 14 to 23. So there's 15 unique words. So let's compare it to Mark 16, 9 to 20. There's 17 unique words in Mark 16, 9 to 20. Mark 13, 14, 23 has 15 unique words. The word immediately is not there. Again is not there. Historic present is not there. And kai is 8 words, which is and, 9 to 10, very similar. And day, 5, very similar to Mark 16, 9 to 20. We look also at Mark 14, 1 to 9. Let's compare to Mark 16, 9 to 20. There's 20 unique words as opposed to 17 in Mark 16, 9 to 20. There's the word immediately is not there, which is a common Markan word. The word again is not there. Dot present is not there. And kai, and, is 8 times, which is similar to the 9 to 10 in 16, 9 to 20. And day is 5 or 6. And you compare it to 14, 1 to 9, there's 5. Then we go to the periscope, Mark 15, 42 to 16, verse 5, very close. Yeah, all right, separated by 4 verses. Unique words is exactly the same as Mark 16, 9 to 20. That's very interesting there. The word immediately, or none. Again, none. Historic present 2, compared to Mark, which has 0. The word kai, 16, 9 to 10, and day, 2, 5 or 6. So the conclusion of this is that if you question based on non-Markan words, you have to question Mark 15, 42 to 16, verse 5, which is basically just preceding that periscope. But especially you've got a question if by in the rules of fairness and equity, you also have to question Mark 14, 1 to 9. You also have to question Mark 13, 40, 20, 23. Mark 12, 1 to 11. Mark 9, 42 to 50. All right, which are exactly the same unique words. All right, so if you look, and Mark chapter 1, 2 to 11. So if you look, Mark has 17 unique words. Mark 1, 2 to 11 has exactly the same. Mark 9, 42 to 50 has exactly the same. Mark 12, 1 to 11 has more. Yeah. Mark 13, 4 to 23 has less by 4. And Mark 14, 1 to 9 has 20 unique words. So when you hear scholars talking about the use of non-Markan words, it's a non-starter really. And I think it's frustrating. I know James Snapp is very frustrated about this, and I agree with him totally. That if people are going to make statements about God's word, get your facts and study and go into the background, read opposing views. It's one thing to get one view, but get opposing views as well. See what the other side are arguing, and I think that's the way to do it. And let's be honest and upfront about what we're doing. And I said, I'm a lay person, but if I can get that evidence, why can't those who are opposing Mark 16, 9 to 20, who are way more educated than myself? All right. So this is my little talk about Mark 16, 9 to 20. Feel free to comment, and God bless you. Take care.